A karate instructor harasses a single mother at a dojo, demanding alternative payment methods, while her 8-year-old son watches in terror. The arrogant bully escalates his threats, physically grabbing the woman and slapping her child across the face for disrespecting him. But the quiet man sitting in the corner isn't just another parent. This is Mike Tyson himself. The instructor has no idea he just assaulted a child in front of a man who's spent decades destroying bullies with his bare hands. While the mother pleads for mercy and other parents look away in fear, the boxing legend rises from his chair with that famous death stare. The cocky martial artist actually challenges the former heavyweight champion, thinking age has made him weak. Parents grab their children as Iron Mike's fists clench, knowing they're about to witness the most one-sided beatdown in dojo history. The instructor keeps talking trash, completely unaware that his next breath might be his last peaceful one. What happens when a fake tough guy meets the real thing? Will the bully survive learning why legends never fade? What happened next would terrorize the instructor for the rest of his pathetic existence. Before we jump back and tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot of East Side. Traditional karate as Mike Tyson pushed through the glass front door. At 58, he moved with the same quiet confidence that had carried him through countless battles, though the gray tracksuit and worn baseball cap made him look more like someone's grandfather than a former heavyweight champion. The soft chime of the door barely registered above the sounds of children practicing inside. "Can I help you?" asked the young receptionist, a 19-year-old with bright eyes and a friendly smile. Her nameplate read, Jenny Martinez. She glanced at him expectantly, clearly not recognizing the face that had once graced magazine covers and pay-per-view broadcasts around the world. "Just here for the community meeting," Tyson replied, his voice carrying that familiar soft rasp that contrasted sharply with his intimidating reputation. Jenny checked her appointment book and nodded toward a row of metal folding chairs lined against the wall. "Mr. Kowalski should be with you shortly." Tyson settled into one of the chairs, his keen eyes immediately drawn to the dozen children practicing on the blue mats. They ranged in age from 6 to 10, their white GIs crisp and clean, their movements precise despite their youth. A young assistant instructor named Bobby Chen guided them through basic kata, his patient corrections spoken in the encouraging tone that good teachers used with beginners. The dojo itself spoke of tradition and respect, faded photographs of martial arts masters lined the walls, and the smell of old wood and dedication hung in the air. This was the kind of place Tyson remembered from his own youth, where discipline and character mattered more than flash and ego. "Mr. Tyson?" The voice belonged to Frank Kowalski, a 71-year-old man whose weathered hands and straight posture told the story of 5 decades in martial arts. His brown eyes lit up with genuine pleasure as he approached. "I can't tell you how honored we are that you're considering our program." Frank kept his voice low, clearly trying not to draw attention to his famous visitor. Tyson appreciated the discretion. He'd learned to value quiet moments away from the spotlight. "Tell me about what you're doing here," Tyson said, watching as a small boy with sandy brown hair struggled to maintain his balance during a particularly challenging sequence. Frank's face brightened as he explained their vision for expanding youth mentorship programs, bringing in positive role models from the community to work with at-risk children. "We believe that proper guidance can change a young person's entire trajectory," he said. "Give them discipline, respect, and someone to look up to." Tyson nodded, understanding the weight of that responsibility. His own childhood had been marked by violence and chaos. He knew firsthand how different his life might have been with the right influences. The children continued their practice with focused intensity, their young faces serious with concentration. Tyson found himself particularly drawn to one boy who reminded him of himself at that age, smaller than the others, working twice as hard to keep up, but showing natural instincts that couldn't be taught. The peaceful atmosphere was suddenly interrupted by the rumble of a diesel engine outside. Frank's expression shifted from welcoming warmth to something that looked uncomfortably like apprehension. "That's our head instructor," Frank said, his voice carrying an apologetic note that immediately put Tyson on alert. "He's different with the children than I am." Through the window, Tyson could see a black pickup truck settling into a parking space. The children on the mats had stopped their practice, their postures subtly changing as heavy footsteps approached the entrance. Even the youngest students seemed to sense that something in the dojo's atmosphere was about to shift. Glenn Morrison burst through the front door like a man who owned everything he surveyed. His black GI was adorned with an excessive collection of patches and medals that caught the overhead lights as he moved, and his cold blue eyes immediately began cataloging every person and detail in the room. At 42, he carried himself with the aggressive confidence of someone who had never been challenged by an equal opponent. "Chun," Morrison's voice cut through the quiet like a blade. "Those stances are sloppy. Make them do it again." The young assistant instructor immediately straightened, nodding quickly as Morrison strode onto the mats. The children's relaxed practice session transformed instantly into something more rigid and fearful. Outside, a beat-up Honda Civic wheezed into the parking lot, its engine coughing before finally settling into silence. Through the windshield, Tyson could see a woman checking the dashboard clock, her face showing the stress of someone running late despite their best efforts. Carol Winters hurried through the entrance, still wearing her hospital scrubs, the fabric wrinkled from a double shift that had started before dawn. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her green eyes held the particular exhaustion of a single mother trying to do everything right with too little time and money. Sorry, she called softly, her voice directed at no one in particular as she glanced at the wall clock. 5:15. 15 minutes late to pick up her son. Morrison stopped his critique mid-sentence and turned to stare at her, making her tardiness a public spectacle. Every parent and child in the room could feel the weight of his disapproval settling over the situation like a dark cloud. "Mrs. Winters," Morrison said, his tone carrying the cold authority of a judge pronouncing sentence. "How nice of you to join us." Carol's cheeks flushed as she moved toward the chairs, offering apologetic nods to the other parents who carefully avoided making eye contact. She settled into a seat near Tyson, her movements quick and nervous as she opened her worn purse. Tyson watched as she carefully counted crumpled bills, 2 20s, a 10, and several ones that looked like tip money from the hospital cafeteria where she clearly worked a second job. Her fingers shook slightly as she smoothed out each bill, the simple action revealing more about her financial struggles than any conversation could have. On the mats, Tommy Winters, the small boy Tyson had noticed earlier, glanced toward his mother with the particular concern that children show when they sense their parents are under stress. The 8-year-old's sandy brown hair was damp with sweat from practice, and his large hazel eyes held an intelligence that seemed older than his years. Frank approached Carol with the gentle manner of someone who understood hardship. "Mrs. Winters, Tommy had a really good session today. His kicks are getting much stronger." But Morrison cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Actually, Frank, I need to discuss some concerns about Tommy's progress." His voice carried across the room, ensuring that everyone could hear what should have been a private conversation. The other parents shifted uncomfortably in their seats, recognizing the setup for something unpleasant. Morrison's pattern was becoming familiar to them. Find the most vulnerable parent, apply pressure, and assert dominance in front of an audience. Carol stood slowly, smoothing her scrubs in a nervous gesture that spoke of someone trying to maintain dignity in a situation designed to strip it away. She had no idea what was coming, but Tyson's trained eye could read Morrison's predatory body language like a roadmap. Morrison positioned himself in the center of the dojo floor, ensuring maximum visibility for what he was about to do. "Mrs. Winters, we need to have a serious discussion about Tommy's commitment issues." The words hung in the air like a threat, and Carol walked toward the center of the room with the careful steps of someone approaching a trap they couldn't avoid. Morrison positioned Carol in the exact center of the dojo floor, a deliberate choice that made her the unwilling star of his performance. Every parent and child in the room had a clear view as he began his calculated assault on her dignity. "Tommy lacks focus," Morrison announced, his voice carrying the false authority of someone who confused cruelty with strength. "His techniques are weak, his spirit is undisciplined." He paused, letting his cold blue eyes sweep across the audience before delivering his first real blow. The boy clearly lacks a strong male influence in his life. Carol's face went pale, but she stood straighter, drawing on reserves of strength that came from 2 years of fighting to keep her family together. Tommy practices at home every day. He takes this very seriously. Morrison's laugh was sharp and dismissive. Practicing at home? Mrs. Winters, martial arts isn't something you can learn from YouTube videos in your living room. He stepped closer, invading her personal space with the practiced ease of a predator. Without his father's discipline, he let the words hang in the air, watching Carol's composure crack slightly at the mention of her dead husband. Tommy, still standing on the mat in his white GI, looked mortified as tears began to well up in his eyes. Maybe the problem isn't just the boy, Morrison continued, his tone becoming more personal, more invasive. Maybe if his mother showed more appreciation for the quality training he receives here, we might see better results. The suggestion was loaded with innuendo that made several parents look away in discomfort. Carol felt the blood rush to her cheeks as she understood the implication behind his words. I pay the same as everyone else, she said firmly, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Tommy works hard, and he's improving every week. Morrison circled her slowly, like a shark sensing weakness in the water. Do you pay the same as everyone else? He made a show of considering the question. Because dedication isn't just about monthly fees, Mrs. Winters. It's about commitment, sacrifice, showing that you truly value what we provide here. Frank started to step forward, his weathered face showing distress at watching his dojo being used as a stage for this humiliation. But Morrison's sharp glance froze him in place. Perhaps, Morrison said, moving even closer to Carol, we could discuss alternative arrangements for Tommy's training. Private lessons, one-on-one attention. His meaning was unmistakable, the words delivered with the confidence of a man who believed his position protected him from consequences. Carol stepped backward, her nurse's training helping her recognize the predatory behavior she'd seen too many times in hospital corridors. I pay full price for my son's lessons, she said, her voice growing stronger. The same as every other parent here. Morrison's smile turned ugly, revealing the petty cruelty that lived beneath his martial arts instructor facade. Do you, though? Because your payment history shows some irregularities. Sometimes you're a few days late. Sometimes the money comes up light. It was a lie, and everyone in the room knew it. But Morrison had learned that public humiliation was more effective than private threats. Carol's face burned with shame as other parents witnessed her financial struggles being weaponized against her. I have never missed a payment, she protested, but her voice lacked the conviction it had held moments before. Morrison pulled out a ledger book, making a show of flipping through pages that contained whatever fictional evidence he needed. Mrs. Winters, perhaps you're just too proud to accept the kind of special arrangements that might benefit both you and Tommy. The false concern in his voice was more insulting than outright hostility would have been. When Carol moved toward the door, intending to take Tommy home rather than endure any more of this public degradation, Morrison's true nature finally revealed itself. We're not finished talking, he said, stepping directly into her path. Carol tried to move around him, but Morrison placed his hand on her shoulder, his grip firm enough to stop her movement. Don't walk away from me, he said, his voice dropping to a more dangerous register. The physical contact crossed a line that even the most intimidated parents recognized. Several stood up from their chairs, and Tommy's quiet sobbing became audible across the silent dojo. Morrison's grip tightened on Carol's shoulder as she tried to shake free. Get your hands off me, Carol said, her voice shaking with anger rather than fear. From his position near the wall, Tyson slowly rose from his metal folding chair. The movement was deliberate and controlled, but it drew Morrison's attention like a magnet draws iron. Morrison's grip on Carol's shoulder tightened as he turned to face the man who had just stood up from the folding chairs. For the first time since entering the dojo, his absolute confidence wavered slightly as he took in Tyson's imposing presence. Something wrong, old man? Morrison asked, his voice carrying the mocking tone he used with anyone he perceived as weak or irrelevant. Tyson didn't respond immediately. His famous stare, the same intimidating look that had frozen opponents in boxing rings around the world, fixed on Morrison with laser intensity. The entire dojo fell silent, even the youngest children sensing that something significant was happening. Frank nervously cleared his throat. Glenn, this is Mike Tyson. He's here about our youth mentorship program. Morrison's expression shifted through several emotions in rapid succession: recognition, surprise, and then a return to his usual arrogance. The boxer? He laughed loudly, playing to his audience of intimidated parents. What's a boxer doing? In a real martial arts school? Tyson remained perfectly still, his dark eyes never leaving Morrison's face. Watching. Learning. Learning. Morrison released Carol's shoulder and moved into an exaggerated karate stance, his hands positioned theatrically for maximum effect. Maybe you'd like to see what real fighting looks like. Not that show business stuff they do in Vegas. The challenge hung in the air like smoke from a fire that was about to spread. Parents began pulling their children closer, sensing that the situation was escalating beyond normal dojo politics. Carol grabbed Tommy's hand, ready to leave, but found herself frozen by the intensity of the moment. Morrison's confidence grew as he mistook Tyson's restraint for weakness. "Come on, champ. Let's see if boxing works against a real martial artist. I'll even go easy on you. Wouldn't want to hurt a senior citizen." Tyson looked around the room, taking in the frightened faces of children and the worried expressions of parents who had brought their kids here to learn discipline and respect. His gaze lingered on Tommy, whose tear-stained face reminded him painfully of his own childhood vulnerability. "Not today," Tyson said quietly, his voice carrying the controlled power of someone who had learned to choose his battles carefully. Morrison misinterpreted this as fear and practically swelled with triumph. "Figures. I'll talk, just like your whole career. Big reputation, but when it comes to real fighting." He shrugged dismissively. Tyson's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he maintained his composure. Years of therapy, meditation, and hard-won wisdom had taught him the difference between necessary action and pointless aggression. Frank tried desperately to defuse the situation. "Perhaps we should all take a step back." But Morrison was drunk on what he perceived as victory over a boxing legend. He turned back to Carol and Tommy, emboldened by Tyson's apparent retreat. "Now, where were we, Mrs. Winters? I believe we were discussing your son's discipline problems." He grabbed Tommy by the collar of his GI, yanking the 8-year-old forward with unnecessary force. "Since your mother thinks regular training methods are too harsh, maybe we need to show her what real discipline looks like." Tommy stumbled but didn't fall, his small hands instinctively coming up to protect himself. The sight of an adult man handling a child roughly in front of his terrified mother was more than several parents could bear, but Morrison's reputation for retaliation kept them silent. "Perhaps some extra conditioning," Morrison continued, his voice taking on a sadistic edge. "Push-ups until you can't lift your arms. Sparring with students twice your size. That's how warriors are made, Mrs. Winters." Carol found her voice. "He's just 8 years old." Morrison whirled on her, his face flushed with anger at being questioned. "He's my student, and I'll train him however I see fit." When Carol reached instinctively for her son, Morrison's hand shot out and grabbed her wrist hard enough to leave marks. "I said back off," he snarled, all pretense of professional demeanor now abandoned. The room held its collective breath as Carol winced but refused to cry out. Tommy's quiet sobbing was the only sound until Tyson took a single step forward. The movement was small, but somehow managed to fill the entire space with tension. Morrison looked up and found himself staring into eyes that had seen violence beyond his imagination. Not the choreographed combat of martial arts demonstrations, but the raw, brutal reality of professional boxing at its highest level. For the first time since Tyson had entered the dojo, Morrison began to understand that he might have made a serious miscalculation. Morrison's confidence returned in a rush as Tyson remained motionless, interpreting the boxer's restraint as weakness. He released Carol's shoulder with theatrical disdain and stepped back, arms spread wide in a gesture of mock invitation. "Come on then, champ," Morrison said, his voice dripping with false bravado as he moved into an exaggerated karate stance. His hands positioned themselves in textbook form, fingers extended, body coiled like a spring waiting to unleash destruction. "Let's see if that Vegas show business translates to real martial arts." The parents in the room shifted uncomfortably, several standing and moving their children toward the exit. They could sense the electricity in the air, the feeling that preceded violence in the same way storm clouds preceded thunder. Carol pulled Tommy closer, her maternal instincts screaming that they needed to leave immediately. But Tyson simply looked around the room, taking in each frightened face with the careful assessment of a man who had learned to calculate the cost of every action. His gaze lingered on Tommy's tear-stained cheeks, on Carol's protective posture, on the other children who stood frozen between their parents and the mats. "Not today," Tyson said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom. Morrison's laugh exploded across the silent dojo like a gunshot. "Figures. All reputation, no substance. Just like your whole career, big talk until someone calls. Your bluff." He began shadowboxing mockingly, throwing exaggerated punches at the air while grinning at his audience. Tyson's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his feet remained planted. Years of therapy and meditation had taught him the difference between necessary violence and ego-driven stupidity. He had nothing to prove to a small-time bully in a strip mall dojo. Frank stepped forward desperately, his weathered hands raised in a peacekeeping gesture. "Perhaps we should all take a step back and stay out of this, old man," Morrison snapped, his attention still fixed on Tyson. "I'm giving our famous guest a chance to show these kids what real champions are made of. Unless he's afraid?" The taunt hung in the air like a challenge thrown down in a medieval court. Several parents began gathering their children's gear, preparing to leave before the situation escalated further. The assistant instructor, Bobby Chun, had already begun ushering the youngest students toward the back exit. Morrison strutted across the mat, his confidence growing with each moment that Tyson failed to respond to his provocations. "That's what I thought. Another washed-up has been living off past glory." He turned back to Carol and Tommy, his predatory smile returning full force. "Now, where were we discussing your son's discipline problems?" Before Carol could respond, Morrison grabbed Tommy's GI collar and yanked the 8-year-old forward with unnecessary force. The boy stumbled but managed to stay on his feet, his small hands instinctively coming up to protect himself. "Since your mother thinks regular training methods are too harsh," Morrison continued, his voice taking on a dangerous edge, "maybe we need to demonstrate what real warriors endure." The sight of an adult man handling a child roughly in front of his terrified mother crossed a line that even the most intimidated parents recognized. Several gasped audibly, but Morrison's reputation for retaliation kept them from speaking up. Carol found her voice. "Let go of him. He's just a child." Morrison's eyes flashed with genuine anger at being challenged. "He's my student, and I'll train him however I see fit." With Tyson's apparent retreat, Morrison's confidence soared to dangerous levels. He released Tommy's collar but kept the boy positioned in the center of the mat like a specimen to be examined. The other children watched in uncomfortable silence, as their instructor's demeanor shifted from merely harsh to something approaching sadistic. "Tommy," Morrison announced loudly enough for everyone to hear, "since your mother thinks our regular training is too demanding, let's show her what real martial artists endure." He gestured imperiously toward the center of the mat. "Demonstrate your kata. All of it. Perfectly." Tommy wiped his eyes with the back of his sleeve and moved into position, his small body trembling from the emotional trauma of watching his mother be humiliated and threatened. The 8-year-old began the familiar sequence of movements he had practiced hundreds of times, but his usual focus was shattered. "Stop," Morrison barked after only 8 moves. "Pathetic. Your stance is weak, your timing is off, and your spirit is broken. Just like I said." He circled the boy like a predator studying wounded prey. "Start again. And this time, show some pride." Tommy reset his position and began again, but the pressure of performing under Morrison's hostile scrutiny made every technique feel clumsy and uncertain. His kicks lacked power, his punches felt sluggish, and his balance wavered with each transition. "Again," Morrison shouted, stopping him even earlier this time. "Are you even trying? This is embarrassing to watch." He gestured toward the other children. "Look how your classmates are staring at you. They're wondering how someone so weak ever earned a white belt." Carol started forward instinctively, but Morrison's sharp glare froze her in place. "This is instruction, Mrs. Winters. Perhaps if you stop coddling him, he might develop some actual skill." Tommy's third attempt was worse than the first 2. His confidence had completely crumbled under the public humiliation, and his 8-year-old mind couldn't process why the adult he was supposed to trust was deliberately destroying his self-esteem. "Enough." Morrison declared with theatrical disgust. Since you can't perform basic kata without embarrassing this dojo, maybe some physical conditioning will teach you the discipline you clearly lack at home. He pointed to a clear section of the mat. 20 push-ups. Now. And count them out loud so everyone can hear exactly how weak you really are. Tommy dropped to the floor and assumed the push-up position, his thin arms already shaking from stress and exhaustion. One, he called out, his voice barely audible. His form was decent for an 8-year-old, but Morrison immediately began criticizing every aspect of his technique. Keep your back straight. Those don't count if you're not doing them right. Morrison's voice grew louder with each repetition, causing Tommy to struggle even more. By the 8th push-up, Tommy's arms were trembling violently. By the 12th, he could barely lower himself halfway to the mat. On the 13th attempt, his arms gave out completely, and he collapsed face first onto the blue vinyl. Quitters don't belong in my dojo, Morrison said coldly. He grabbed Tommy's GI and hauled the exhausted boy to his feet, his grip rough, enough to leave marks on the child's thin arms. Carol couldn't contain herself any longer. He's just a child. You're being cruel. Morrison whirled on her, his face flushed with anger at being challenged in front of his audience. He's my student, and I'll train him however I see fit. If you don't like my methods, you're free to find another school. When Carol instinctively reached for her son, Morrison's hand shot out and clamped down on her wrist with bruising force. I said back off. The room fell into dead silence except for Tommy's quiet sobbing. Then Tyson took a single step forward, his movement causing Morrison to look up from his victims and see something in those dark eyes that made him release Carol's wrist immediately. Morrison, still riding the adrenaline high of his perceived victory over Tyson, decided that breaking Tommy completely would serve as the perfect demonstration of his absolute authority. His grip on power required constant reinforcement through displays of dominance, and an 8-year-old boy provided the perfect target. Since your mother thinks you're too delicate for real training, Morrison announced, positioning himself directly in front of Tommy like a drill sergeant addressing a failing recruit. Let's show everyone what actual discipline looks like. He ordered Tommy to stand at perfect attention while he demonstrated what he called proper defensive positioning. But Morrison's movements were designed to intimidate rather than instruct, sharp, aggressive gestures that made the boy flinch. With each sudden motion, "Stop shaking," Morrison roared, his voice echoing off the dojo walls. Warriors don't shake. Warriors don't cry. Warriors don't embarrass their instructors in front of paying customers. Tommy tried desperately to control his trembling, but fear and exhaustion had overwhelmed his 8-year-old nervous system. Each attempt to stand straighter only made him shake more visibly, which triggered increasingly harsh criticism from Morrison. The other children watched in horrified fascination, recognizing that what was happening to Tommy could easily happen to any of them. Their parents exchanged worried glances but remained silent, paralyzed by Morrison's reputation for retaliation against families who challenged his authority. Frank took a tentative step forward, his weathered face showing deep distress at watching his life's work being perverted into this display of cruelty. But Morrison's sharp glare stopped the elderly dojo owner cold. "Something to say, Frank?" Morrison asked with dangerous sweetness. "Or are you going to let me teach my students properly?" Frank's shoulders sagged in defeat. At 71, he felt too old and weak to challenge a man who had systematically intimidated him into surrender over the past 3 years. Morrison returned his attention to Tommy, who was now swaying slightly on his feet from emotional and physical exhaustion. "Look at you," he said with theatrical disgust. "No focus, no strength, no heart. Your father would be ashamed to see what his son has become." The mention of his dead father hit Tommy like a physical blow. His legs trembled more violently, and fresh tears began streaming down his already wet cheeks. "Maybe some direct correction will teach you the respect you clearly didn't learn at home," Morrison continued, raising his hand as if to demonstrate a proper defensive block. Carol sensed what was coming and started forward again. "Don't you dare," but Morrison's hand was already in motion, swinging down in a sharp arc that connected with Tommy's cheek in a crisp slap that echoed through the suddenly silent dojo like a gunshot. The sound seemed to hang in the air forever. Tommy staggered but didn't fall, his small hand instinctively rising to touch his stinging cheek. The red handprint was clearly visible against his pale skin. "Maybe that will teach you some respect," Morrison said coldly, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a man who believed he had just delivered an important lesson. Carol gasped audibly, and several parents drew sharp breaths. The casual violence against a child crossed every line of decency, but Morrison's web of intimidation had trained them all to remain silent witnesses to his cruelty. Tommy stood there swaying, tears flowing freely now, touching his burning cheek, while trying to understand why the adult he was supposed to trust had deliberately hurt him. The room was frozen in shocked silence. Then Mike Tyson began to move. He didn't speak. He didn't rush. He simply stood and began walking toward Morrison, with deliberate, measured steps that seemed to echo despite the padded mats. Each footfall carried the weight of controlled fury that had been building since the moment he first witnessed Morrison's behavior. Morrison turned and found himself staring into eyes that had seen real violence, not the choreographed brutality of martial arts demonstrations, but the raw, honest savagery of professional boxing at its most lethal level. For the first time in years, Glenn Morrison felt genuine fear. Tyson stopped exactly 3 feet from Morrison, close enough that the karate instructor could see every detail of the expression that had frozen heavyweight contenders around the world. When Tyson spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried clearly through the silent dojo with the authority of absolute certainty. "Nobody hits kids around me." Morrison's brain struggled to process the shift in dynamics. Moments ago, he had been the undisputed master of his domain, confident that his reputation and position protected him from consequences. Now he found himself staring into the face of controlled violence that made his martial arts posturing look like children's theater. "It was just discipline," Morrison said, trying to laugh off the situation while taking a half-step backward. "You don't understand martial arts culture. Sometimes correction requires." "I understand bullies." Tyson cut him off, his voice still quiet, but carrying undertones that made several parents involuntarily step back. Someone in the crowd whispered, "Oh my God, that's really Mike Tyson," as if the reality of the situation was just beginning to penetrate their shock. Morrison's bravado wavered for a moment, then returned with desperate intensity. He had built his entire identity around never backing down, never showing weakness in front of his students and their families. His reputation required him to challenge anyone who threatened his authority, regardless of the consequences. "I don't care who you used to be, old man," Morrison said, puffing out his chest and moving into a fighting stance. "This is my dojo. These are my students. You're just a washed-up has-been living off past glory." Tyson nodded slowly, as if considering the assessment with genuine interest. "Used to be." The question hung in the air like the calm before an earthquake. Morrison, misinterpreting Tyson's restraint as uncertainty, made the fatal error of pressing his perceived advantage. "Yeah, used to be," he repeated, stepping forward and shoving Tyson's chest with both hands. "Now you're just another old man who can't accept that his time is over." The push was meant to establish dominance, to show everyone in the room that Morrison feared no one. Instead, it triggered a response that would be replayed in nightmares for years to come. Tyson's left hook was instantaneous and devastating. The punch traveled less than 8 inches but carried the accumulated power of decades of professional training, prison yard survival, and protective fury for an 8-year-old boy who reminded him of his own vulnerable childhood. Morrison's feet left the ground. For a suspended moment, he hung in the air like a rag doll, his eyes rolled back and his body completely limp. Then gravity reclaimed him, sending him crashing into the wall mirror behind him. The impact spiderwebbed the glass before it exploded in a shower of reflective fragments that tinkled to the floor like deadly rain. Morrison slid down the wall and crumpled onto the mats, his face purple as he gasped desperately for air that his paralyzed diaphragm couldn't process. His hands clawed weakly at his chest while his mouth opened and closed like a fish drowning in air. The entire room stared in stunned silence at the speed and devastating efficiency of what they had just witnessed. Parents who had seen Morrison's arrogance for months suddenly understood the difference between a martial arts instructor and a professional fighter who had survived the most brutal sport in the world. Tyson stood over Morrison's crumpled form, not even breathing hard from the exertion. "Still used to be?" he asked conversationally. Morrison could only wheeze in response, his consciousness focused entirely on the basic act of breathing. Parents began gathering their children quickly, some offering quiet words of gratitude to Tyson as they filed toward the exit. Carol clutched Tommy protectively, her eyes wide with a mixture of gratitude, shock, and concern for what might come next. Frank stared at the destroyed mirror and his gasping head instructor, finally understanding that everything in his dojo was about to change. Forever. 15 minutes later, the East Side traditional karate dojo looked like a crime scene. Fragments of mirror glass caught the overhead lights as Jenny Martinez carefully swept them into a dustpan, her young face pale with shock at what she had witnessed. The other parents and children had fled quickly after Morrison's brutal lesson. In humility, leaving only the key players to deal with the aftermath, Morrison sat propped against the wall where he had landed, still holding his ribs and breathing carefully. His face had returned to normal color, but the humiliation burned in his cold blue eyes like acid. The confident authority that had defined his personality for years lay shattered as completely as the mirror behind him. Frank hovered nervously between the two men, his weathered hands wringing as he tried to find words that might defuse a situation that had already exploded beyond any hope of peaceful resolution. "Perhaps we should all cool down and talk about this tomorrow," Frank suggested with the desperate optimism of an old man watching his life's work crumble. "Everyone's emotions are running high. That psycho attacked me." Morrison cut him off, his voice still raspy but gaining strength with his returning breath. "I'm calling the police." Assault and battery, destruction of property. Tyson remained perfectly calm, his hands relaxed at his sides as he studied Morrison like a scientist observing an interesting specimen. "You hit a child first," he said simply. "Room full of witnesses. Saw you slap an 8-year-old boy across the face." Morrison's face flushed again as he realized the legal implications of his actions. In a room full of parents with cell phone cameras, his assault on Tommy had been thoroughly documented. His threats would sound hollow to any prosecutor who reviewed the evidence. Carol stood protectively close to Tommy, who clung to her scrubs, while staring at the destruction with wide eyes. She had never seen violence that swift and decisive, and part of her was still processing the fact that someone had finally stood up for her son. Morrison struggled to his feet, using the wall for support as his legs steadied beneath him. His martial arts uniform was wrinkled and stained, his carefully cultivated image of invincible authority reduced to that of a battered bully who had finally met his match. "Fine," he snarled, pointing at Carol and Tommy with trembling finger. "You and your brat are banned from this dojo. Permanently. Don't ever set foot in here again." Carol started to protest. She had already paid for the entire month, money she couldn't afford to lose, but Morrison cut her off with vicious satisfaction. "Consider it payment for the mirror," he said, gesturing at the destruction behind him. As Morrison limped toward his office, favoring his left side where Tyson's punch had rearranged his understanding of real power, he turned back to deliver a parting threat. "You picked the wrong side today, Mrs. Winters. I remember faces. I remember families." His meaning was unmistakable. Carol gathered Tommy's gear with shaking hands while Tyson watched Morrison disappear into the back office like a wounded animal, retreating to its den. "This isn't over," Tyson said quietly to Frank. Frank looked at the broken mirror, then at the office door where Morrison had vanished. "No," he agreed sadly, "I don't think it is." The late afternoon sun slanted across the parking lot as Carol loaded Tommy's karate gear into the trunk of her beat-up Honda Civic. Her hands moved automatically through the familiar routine, but her mind was still processing the violence she had witnessed and the strange mixture of gratitude and fear that came with it. Tommy sat quietly in the passenger seat, his small face pressed against the window as he stared back at the dojo. The red mark on his cheek had faded, but the emotional impact of Morrison's cruelty would take much longer to heal. Tyson approached the car as Carol closed the trunk, his movements careful and non-threatening. Despite what she had just seen him do to Morrison, his presence felt protective rather than dangerous. "You okay?" he asked simply. Carol nodded without meeting his eyes, her fingers nervously adjusting the strap of her purse. "Tommy needs those lessons," she said, her voice carrying the exhaustion of a single mother who had just watched another support system crumble. "It's the only place he feels strong." Tyson glanced through the windshield at the boy, seeing the familiar combination of vulnerability and hidden potential that had marked his own childhood. Tommy was small for his age, exactly as Tyson had been, carrying himself with the careful awareness of someone who had learned early that the world could be cruel. "There are other dojos," Tyson suggested gently. Carol shook her head with the bitter knowledge of someone who had explored every option. "This was the closest to our apartment. The cheapest. I worked 2 jobs just to afford what we were paying here." Something in her voice, the particular strain of someone carrying too much alone, made Tyson study her face more carefully. He saw the familiar combination of exhaustion and determination that marked people who refused to quit despite overwhelming odds. Carol Winters was fighting a war on multiple fronts, and today's battle had cost her another valuable resource. "Insurance from the hospital covers most of our medical," she continued, almost talking to herself. "But activities like this, Tommy needs something that makes him feel capable, strong." After his father, she trailed off, unwilling to share family trauma with a stranger, even one who had just protected her son. Carol moved toward the driver's door, but Tommy rolled down his window before she could start the engine. "Mr. Tyson?" The 8-year-old's voice was still shaky from crying, but his hazel eyes held genuine gratitude. "Thank you for helping my mom." The simple words hit Tyson unexpectedly hard, stirring memories of his own childhood when adult protection had been rare and precious. "You remind me of myself at your age," he said gently. Carol overheard the comment and looked at him with new interest, perhaps beginning to understand that this wasn't just a celebrity making polite conversation. "Your father would be proud of how you stood up in there," Tyson told Tommy, recognizing the boy's attempt to protect his mother even when outmatched and afraid. Carol's face hardened at the mention of her husband, old pain flickering across her features like shadows from a dying fire. "His father's dead," she said flatly. "Killed 2 years ago." She started the engine, then hesitated as if deciding whether to trust this stranger with information that could be dangerous. "He was Detective David Winters," she said finally. "Maybe you heard about it on the news. Car accident on Highway 15. Tyson's expression sharpened as the name registered. In his memory, Detective David Winters, the honest cop whose mechanical failure had made headlines because it happened just as he was building a case against local corruption and illegal gambling operations. Carol drove away, leaving Tyson standing alone in the parking lot as pieces of a much larger and more dangerous puzzle began forming in his mind. Dawn was breaking over the city when Tyson pushed through the front door of East Side Traditional Karate at exactly 6 a.m. He knew from observing Frank's routine that the elderly dojo owner arrived early to prepare for adult classes, preferring the quiet morning hours before Morrison's intimidating presence transformed the atmosphere. Frank looked up from his cluttered desk as Tyson entered the office, his weathered face showing no surprise at the early visit. Insurance paperwork for the broken mirror was spread across the desk like evidence of a crime that couldn't be covered up. "Figured you'd be back," Frank said simply, setting down his pen and studying Tyson's determined expression. Tyson settled into the worn chair across from Frank's desk, his presence somehow making the small office feel even smaller. "Tell me about Morrison. The real story." Frank hesitated, his brown eyes darting toward the door as if expecting Morrison to materialize from the shadows. Then he stood and turned the deadbolt, sealing them inside with secrets that had been festering for too long. "What I'm about to tell you," Frank began, then stopped and started again. "If Morrison finds out I talked, my problems become much bigger than a broken mirror." Tyson leaned forward, his famous intensity focused entirely on the old man's frightened face. "He's already crossed lines that can't be uncrossed. What's he really running here?" Frank opened a desk drawer and pulled out a manila folder that had been hidden beneath financial records. His hands shook slightly as he placed it on the desk between them. "Morrison's been recruiting our most promising teenage students for underground fighting," Frank said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Parents think their kids are competing in legitimate tournaments, but they're actually fighting in illegal matches across 3 counties. Tyson opened the folder and found photographs that made his jaw clench with controlled fury. Teenage boys with faces swollen from illegal bouts, their eyes holding the hollow look of children forced to grow up too fast. Financial records showing Morrison taking 60% of their winnings while their families struggled to pay for tournament fees and special training. Parents are too scared to complain, Frank continued, his voice gaining strength as the truth finally emerged. Kids who refuse to fight, they get hurt in training accidents. Or their families suddenly face other problems, lost jobs, vandalized property, mysterious car troubles. Frank showed Tyson more evidence, documentation of intimidated families, recorded threats, and a pattern of systematic exploitation that had been growing for years. I've been collecting this evidence for 18 months, Frank admitted, but I'm 71 years old and scared. Morrison has connections I can't fight alone. Tyson studied the photographs of beaten teenagers, seeing echoes of his own violent youth in their desperate faces. How long has this been going on? Frank checked his watch nervously. Morrison would arrive for the morning adult class within the hour. 3 years. Started right after Detective David Winters began investigating local illegal gambling operations. The timing hit Tyson like a physical blow. Detective Winters, Carol's murdered husband, had been getting close to Morrison's network when his brakes mysteriously failed on a mountain highway. Winters was asking questions about martial arts. Schools being used as recruiting grounds, Frank continued. Morrison was nervous for weeks before the detective's accident. After Winters died, Morrison's operation expanded rapidly. Tyson closed the folder, his mind already calculating the scope of the conspiracy they were facing. This wasn't just a bullying karate instructor. This was organized crime using children as disposable weapons. The sound of Morrison's truck pulling into the parking lot cut their conversation short. Frank quickly locked the evidence back in his desk drawer, but both men knew that yesterday's confrontation had started something that couldn't be stopped. The lunch rush at downtown General Hospital's cafeteria moved with practiced efficiency as Carol worked behind the serving counter, ladling portions of meatloaf and mashed potatoes for doctors, nurses, and visitors who barely looked at her face. The anonymity suited her. After yesterday's confrontation at the dojo, she welcomed the routine invisibility of her second job. But anonymity was exactly what she wasn't going to get. Rick Bannon stood out in the hospital cafeteria like a predator. In a petting zoo, his expensive charcoal suit and perfectly groomed appearance screamed corporate money, but his cold gray eyes held the calculating patience of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted through fear rather than negotiation. He approached Carol's serving station during the busiest part of the lunch rush, when the constant flow of customers would make their conversation seem casual to any observers. Mrs. Winters? His voice carried the smooth confidence of a man who had perfected the art of civilized intimidation. I'm Rick Bannon. I represent some business interests that intersect with your recent situation. Carol continued serving food, deliberately avoiding eye contact as she spooned vegetables onto plates with mechanical precision. I don't know what you're talking about. Bannon's smile held no warmth, like sunlight reflecting off ice. Your son's martial arts training. Mr. Morrison mentioned you had a disagreement yesterday. He paused, letting the implications settle. Quite a dramatic disagreement, from what I understand. A chill ran down Carol's spine as she realized that Morrison's network extended far beyond the dojo. These people had been watching her, analyzing her vulnerabilities, preparing their response to yesterday's events. I don't have anything to discuss with you, she said quietly, serving a bowl of soup to a tired-looking intern who nodded his thanks before hurrying away. Bannon moved closer to the counter, his presence making other customers unconsciously step back. Mrs. Winters, I think you misunderstand the nature of our conversation. This isn't a request for discussion, it's an opportunity for education. He leaned across the sneeze guard, speaking just loud enough for Carol to hear, but too quietly for other customers to catch his words. Morrison called me last night. Seems like you brought some unwanted attention to our operation. That boxer, friend of yours, cost us a significant amount of money. Carol's hands began to shake as she realized the full scope of what they were facing. These men knew about Tyson's intervention, knew about her connection to him, and were already planning their retaliation. I don't know anything about any operation, she managed, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. Bannon straightened his tie with the casual gesture of a man adjusting his tools before beginning serious work. Good. That's exactly the attitude we like to see. Ignorance is much safer than curiosity, Mrs. Winters. He glanced around the busy cafeteria, his gaze cataloging exits, security cameras, and potential witnesses with professional thoroughness. And Mrs. Winters? It would be extremely unfortunate if something happened to interrupt your employment here. Single mothers need stable income, don't they? Hospital administrators tend to frown on employees who bring complications to the workplace. The threat was delivered with the same tone he might use to discuss the weather, but its meaning was crystal clear. Carol's job, her ability to support Tommy, her entire fragile financial structure could disappear with a single phone call. As Bannon walked away, his expensive shoes clicking against the linoleum floor, Carol's supervisor approached with concerned curiosity. "Who was that?" she asked, watching Bannon exit through the main hospital doors. Carol watched until he disappeared completely, then turned back to serving lunch with hands that trembled despite her efforts to control them. "Trouble," she said simply. That evening, Carol drove through downtown traffic with the careful attention of someone who had spent the day looking over her shoulder. Bannon's visit to the hospital had shattered any illusion that yesterday's confrontation would simply fade away. These people knew where she worked, where Tommy went to school, and probably where they lived. She found Tyson in the lobby restaurant of the Marriott downtown, sitting alone at a corner table with a cup of coffee and a small notebook. When she approached, he immediately saw the fear in her green eyes and closed the notebook without being asked. "They came to my work today," she said without preamble, sliding into the chair across from him. Tyson's expression darkened as Carol described Bannon's visit and veiled threats. The boxer's hands remained relaxed on the table, but something dangerous flickered behind his dark eyes. "This is bigger than a dojo dispute," he said quietly. Carol reached into her purse and pulled out a small external hard drive, her fingers shaking slightly as she placed it on the table between them. "David was building a case before he died. I've been hiding this for 2 years." She looked around the restaurant nervously, checking faces and exits with the paranoid awareness of someone who had learned that safety was an illusion. "My husband was obsessive about documentation," she continued, pulling out Tyson's laptop as he nodded permission. "He said if something happened to him, this drive would tell the whole story." The hard drive contained a digital treasure trove of evidence that painted a picture of corruption spanning 3 counties. Financial records showed money flowing between Morrison's dojo and a network of illegal fighting operations. Surveillance photos captured teenage fighters entering underground venues. Recorded conversations revealed the systematic exploitation of children whose families were too intimidated to resist. David was getting close to the main players when his brakes failed on Highway 15, Carol said, her voice steady but her hands trembling as she scrolled through crime scene photos of her husband's crash. The police called it mechanical failure, but David was paranoid about car maintenance after his partner was killed in a car accident the year before. Tyson studied the forensic reports and accident reconstruction data. The evidence was circumstantial, but damning. Detective David Winters had been asking too many questions about the wrong people. "These aren't accidents," Tyson said grimly. Carol nodded, finally voicing the truth she had carried alone for 2 years. "Morrison killed my husband, and now he's threatening my son because we got in his way." She showed Tyson financial records proving that Morrison's operation had expanded dramatically after David's death, suggesting that the detective's investigation had been close to exposing the entire network. "Why didn't you take this to the FBI?" Tyson asked. Carol's laugh was bitter. "With what proof? David's dead, his partner transferred to another state, and Morrison has connections everywhere. Who would believe a widowed nurse with conspiracy theories?" Tyson closed the laptop, his mind already calculating the scope of what they were facing. This wasn't just about protecting one family. This was about dismantling a criminal organization that used children as weapons. "They will now," he said simply. The next morning, Carol discovered her Honda Civic's windshield spiderwebbed with cracks from a precise impact in the center. The damage was too deliberate to be vandalism. Someone had used a tool designed specifically for breaking automotive glass. She stood in the hospital parking lot, staring at the destruction while other employees walked past on their way to morning shifts. The hospital's security office claimed their cameras had mysteriously malfunctioned during the night, the same technical failure that seemed to follow Morrison's people wherever they operated. 20 minutes later, Carol's phone rang while she restocked supplies in the cardiac unit. Mrs. Winters? This is Principal Martinez from Tommy's school. The woman's voice carried the careful neutrality of someone delivering unwelcome news. Two men came by yesterday asking about Tommy's enrollment and emergency contact information. Carol's blood turned to ice water. What kind of men? They claimed to be updating emergency contact databases for the district, but something felt wrong about their questions. They wanted to know Tommy's pickup schedule, which classes he attended, whether he walked home alone. Carol gripped the phone tighter, her nursing training helping her remain functional despite the terror flooding her system. Did they show identification? They had badges, but our secretary said they looked unofficial. We've tightened security today, but I thought you should know. After her shift ended, Carol drove home through side streets, checking her mirrors constantly for signs of surveillance. The men watching her were professionals, but their presence felt like weight pressing against her consciousness. Her apartment building looked normal from the outside, but Carol's key turned too easily in the lock. She pushed the door open slowly, immediately sensing that something was wrong. Nothing was missing, but everything was slightly wrong. Tommy's school papers had been moved on the kitchen table. Her laptop was closed when she clearly remembered leaving it open. The kitchen drawers were shut completely when she habitually left them slightly ajar. Someone had been inside, searching carefully, wanting her to know they had been there without making it obvious enough for police reports. On the kitchen table, placed precisely in the center where she couldn't miss it, was a handwritten note in Morrison's distinctive block letters. Still have David's files? Better return them before someone gets hurt. Carol immediately called Tyson, her voice shaking despite her efforts to remain calm. They were in my home, while Tommy was at school. Pack overnight bags, Tyson said without hesitation. Both of you. You're not staying there tonight. While Carol gathered essentials, she noticed a sedan parked across the street that hadn't been there when she arrived. Two men sat inside, making no effort to hide their surveillance. They wanted her to see them, to understand that privacy was another illusion that Morrison's organization could shatter at will. Tommy's overnight bag was packed with the efficiency of a child who had learned that stability was temporary. He didn't ask questions about why they were leaving, accepting his mother's explanations with the resigned wisdom of someone whose young life had already contained too much uncertainty. As they drove toward Tyson's hotel, Carol watched the sedan follow them for 6 blocks before disappearing into traffic. The message was clear. They could be found anywhere, anytime Morrison decided he wanted them. The game had escalated beyond intimidation into active psychological warfare, and Carol finally understood that running wasn't an option. Morrison's reach was too long, his network too extensive, and his patience too thin. They were trapped in a war they hadn't chosen, fighting an enemy who specialized in destroying families. The safe hotel room Tyson had secured with cash felt like a temporary fortress, but Carol knew that safety was an illusion when facing an organization with Morrison's resources. She sat on the edge of the bed while Tommy practiced karate forms in the small space between the dresser and the window, his movements helping him process stress in the only way he knew how. At 9:17 a.m., Morrison called Carol's cell phone directly. "Having a nice vacation, Mrs. Winters?" His voice carried the smug satisfaction of a predator who had successfully cornered his prey. Carol put the phone on speaker so Tyson could hear, her hands trembling slightly as Morrison's confidence filled the room like poison gas. "My associates tell me you've been sharing family photos with unauthorized people," Morrison continued, his reference to David's files making it clear that their every move was being monitored. Tyson moved closer to the phone, his presence somehow making the small room feel safer despite the technological invasion of their privacy. "Here's what's going to happen," Morrison announced with the authority of someone accustomed to having his orders followed without question. "You're going to return what belongs to me, and your boy is going to participate in a special demonstration at the dojo Saturday night." The word demonstration carried ominous undertones that made Carol's maternal instincts scream warnings. "What kind of demonstration?" she asked, though she suspected she didn't want to know the answer. Morrison's laugh was cold and mechanical. "Just a sparring exhibition for potential new students and their parents. Nothing dangerous, just showing proper technique and the kind of discipline we instill in our advanced students." But his tone suggested something far more sinister than A routine demonstration. Tommy will be paired with one of our brown belt teenagers. Morrison continued. Marcus Rodriguez is 16, very skilled, very enthusiastic about following instructions. It should be quite educational for everyone involved. Carol gripped the phone tighter, understanding that this wasn't about martial arts education. He's 8 years old. So, Morrison's response was delivered with casual cruelty. Warriors start young, Mrs. Winters. Some of history's greatest fighters began training as children. Tommy will learn valuable lessons about respect, discipline, and the consequences of challenging authority. The subtext was unmistakable. Tommy would be deliberately hurt in front of an audience, probably seriously enough to require medical attention that would bankrupt Carol and force her into Morrison's debt. If you refuse, Morrison continued, or if that boxer friend of yours shows up again, well, accidents happen in training all the time. Young bones are so fragile, and emergency rooms ask so many questions about suspicious injuries. The threat was designed to paralyze Carol with impossible choices: allow her son to be hurt publicly, or risk him being hurt privately with no witnesses to protect him. Saturday, 7 p.m., Morrison concluded. Don't disappoint me, Mrs. Winters. I'd hate for Tommy to learn about disappointment the hard way. The line went dead, leaving Carol staring at the silent phone while Tommy continued practicing his forms, unaware that his childhood was being weaponized against his family. Tyson took the phone from Carol's shaking hands and immediately began making calls of his own, his voice carrying the controlled fury of someone who had finally heard enough. The demonstration Morrison was planning would happen exactly as scheduled, but not the way he expected. Friday afternoon found Tyson sitting across from Frank in a downtown coffee shop, the elderly dojo owner's weathered hands wrapped around a cup that had grown cold while he delivered increasingly disturbing news. Morrison scheduled Tommy against Marcus Rodriguez, Frank said, his voice barely audible above the ambient noise of afternoon customers. The kid's 16, 150 pounds, brown belt level. He's been fighting in Morrison's underground circuit for 8 months. Tyson studied the surveillance photos Frank had brought. Marcus in various illegal fighting venues, his young face showing the hollow exhaustion of a teenager forced to grow up too fast and too violently. Marcus is a good kid trapped in an impossible situation, Frank continued. His father's in the country illegally, works construction under a false name. Morrison found out and uses deportation threats to control the whole family. The photos showed Marcus's progression from reluctant participant to skilled fighter, his technique improving while his eyes grew deader with each documented bout. Morrison told Marcus to teach the Winters boy some respect, Frank said, his voice heavy with the weight of watching children be corrupted by adult evil. The kid's terrified, but he has no choice. If he refuses, his father gets deported and his family loses everything. Tyson's hands formed fists as he processed the systematic cruelty of Morrison's operation. Every angle was designed to create impossible choices that trapped families in webs of fear and obligation. What's Morrison's real plan? Tyson asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Frank glanced around the coffee shop nervously before leaning closer. He wants Tommy seriously injured in the demonstration. Nothing permanently disabling, but enough to require expensive medical treatment. Then he offers Carol a deal: fight in his underground circuit to pay off Tommy's medical bills. The plan was diabolically simple and devastatingly effective. Carol would become another trapped parent, fighting for money she would never be allowed to keep, while Tommy became leverage to ensure her continued participation. He's done this before, Frank confirmed. 3 families so far. The parents fight, accumulate debt instead of earning money, and their kids become Morrison's property to train for bigger fights. It's generational slavery disguised as martial arts instruction. Tyson made a decision that had been building since he first witnessed Morrison's cruelty. Call the FBI. Tell them everything. Give them copies of all your evidence. Frank nodded grimly. Already did. Agent Patricia Hayes is coordinating with federal prosecutors, but they need time to build a case that will stick. The earliest they can move is Sunday morning. Tommy's demonstration is tomorrow night. I know. Frank's expression showed the helpless frustration of a man watching a train wreck in slow motion. They said they can't act on speculation, only evidence. They Need Morrison to actually commit a federal crime with witnesses. Tyson stood up, his decision made with the finality of someone who had spent decades learning when to fight and when to wait. Morrison wants a demonstration, he said quietly. He's going to get one he'll never forget. As they left the coffee shop, neither man noticed the car that had been following Frank since he left the dojo, or the telephoto lens capturing their meeting from across the street. Morrison's network was vast, professional, and patient, but it had never faced someone like Mike Tyson operating with the focused fury of righteous vengeance. The demonstration would happen exactly as scheduled, but the lessons learned would be entirely different from what Morrison expected. Saturday evening arrived with the oppressive weight of an approaching storm. Tyson sat in his hotel room at 6:15 p.m., watching Tommy practice the basic punching combinations he had taught him over the past few days. The 8-year-old's movements were precise for his age, but Tyson knew that technique meant nothing against a skilled teenager who outweighed him by nearly 100 pounds. "Remember what I told you," Tyson said gently, kneeling to Tommy's eye level. "If someone bigger tries to hurt you, you get low, get close, and get out. Don't try to be a hero, just survive until help arrives." Tommy nodded seriously, his hazel eyes holding an understanding that no child should possess. "Will you be there, Mr. Tyson?" "Every second," Tyson promised. Carol paced by the window, her nervous energy filling the small room like electricity before lightning strikes. She had barely slept in 2 days, her maternal instincts screaming that she was walking her son into a trap designed to destroy their family. "Maybe we should just run," she said for the dozenth time. "Leave town tonight. Change our names. Start over somewhere Morrison can't find us." Tyson shook his head with the patience of someone who had learned that running from bullies only created more bullies. "Running doesn't solve this. Morrison will find other kids to hurt, other families to destroy." He checked his phone. A text from Frank confirmed that FBI agent Patricia Hayes would arrive at 8 p.m., an hour after the demonstration began. Close enough to arrest the survivors, but too late to prevent whatever Morrison had planned. At 6:45, they drove separately to the dojo. Carol and Tommy arrived first, finding the parking lot fuller than usual. Morrison had invited potential new students and their parents to witness his advanced training methods, ensuring maximum humiliation for his victims. Inside, the dojo buzzed with uncomfortable energy. Parents who clearly had money sat in folding chairs arranged amphitheater style. Around the mats, several men in expensive suits stood near the back. Morrison's criminal associates who had come to ensure their investment in systematic cruelty paid proper dividends. Morrison greeted Carol and Tommy with theatrical warmth that fooled no one who understood his true nature. "Mrs. Winters, so wonderful that you decided to join our little exhibition." His cold blue eyes lingered on Tommy with the satisfaction of a predator who had successfully cornered his prey. Tommy clung to his mother's hand, his 8-year-old instincts recognizing danger even when he couldn't fully understand its scope. Through the window, Carol saw Tyson's rental car pull into the parking lot. Morrison followed her gaze, and his smile widened with anticipation. "Excellent," Morrison said with genuine pleasure. "I was hoping your friend would attend. It's so important for children to have proper role models, people who understand when they're outmatched and know their place." Rick Bannon stood near the back wall with 3 associates, all watching Tyson's entrance with the predatory patience of wolves surrounding a lone deer. Morrison called for attention, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to commanding fear. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we have a very special demonstration of advanced sparring techniques. You'll see the kind of discipline and respect that separates true martial artists from mere pretenders." The trap was set, the audience assembled, and the performance about to begin, but Mike Tyson had his own ideas about who would be teaching lessons tonight. Tyson entered the dojo to find 30-plus people crowding the mat area, a mixture of legitimate parents with their children and several men who clearly weren't there for martial arts education. The atmosphere felt electric with tension, like a powder keg waiting for a spark. Bannon and his associates positioned themselves strategically near the exits, their expensive suits and predatory awareness marking them as the enforcement arm of Morrison's operation. They watched Tyson's entrance with professional interest, calculating angles and odds with the cold efficiency of experienced criminals. Ladies and gentlemen, Morrison announced from the center of the mats, tonight's demonstration will feature two of our students showing the practical application of martial arts training in a realistic sparring scenario. On the bench near the wall sat Marcus Rodriguez, a 16-year-old whose brown belt and muscular build told the story of serious training. But his downcast expression and nervous fidgeting revealed a young man who didn't want to be there. Marcus looked miserable as he stared at Tommy, who sat beside his mother looking impossibly small and vulnerable. At 16 and 150 pounds, Marcus was nearly twice Tommy's size, with the reach and power advantages that made this matchup grotesquely unfair. Frank caught Tyson's eye from across the room and tapped his watch meaningfully. Agent Patricia Hayes and her federal team were still 90 minutes away, too late to prevent whatever Morrison had orchestrated, but close enough to handle the aftermath. Tyson discreetly used his phone to upload David's files to a secure cloud server, then sent copies to 3 different news organizations with instructions to publish everything if he didn't check in by midnight. If Morrison wanted to escalate tonight's demonstration into something deadly, Tyson would ensure the entire story came out regardless of personal consequences. Morrison noticed Tyson's phone activity and moved closer with false friendliness. "Mr. Tyson, please put away your device. We're about to begin our demonstration, and I want everyone's full attention on the educational value of what they're about to witness." Tyson pocketed the phone and crossed his arms, his famous death stare focused entirely on Morrison's confident face. "Wouldn't miss it." Morrison's grin turned predatory as he sensed victory within reach. "Oh, I guarantee you won't forget what you see here tonight. Sometimes the most valuable lessons are the most memorable." He gestured toward Marcus and Tommy, who stood reluctantly as their names were called. The size difference was even more shocking when they stood side by side. Marcus looked like a young man, while Tommy looked like the child he was. "Our demonstration tonight will show the importance of proper technique, mental discipline, and respect for authority," Morrison announced to his captive audience. Sometimes young students need firm correction to understand these fundamental principles. Several parents shifted uncomfortably in their seats, beginning to understand that they weren't here to observe routine martial arts instruction. The legitimate families had been invited as unwitting witnesses to ensure Tommy's public humiliation would be complete and inescapable. Carol gripped her seat arms so tightly her knuckles turned white as she watched her son being positioned for systematic destruction. Marcus whispered something to Tommy that might have been an apology, but Morrison's sharp clap demanded immediate attention. "Gentlemen, take your positions," Morrison commanded with the authority of a Roman emperor ordering gladiators into the arena. Tommy walked to the center of the mat with the careful dignity of someone facing inevitable defeat, while Marcus followed reluctantly, clearly wishing he could be anywhere else in the world. Tyson calculated distances, angles, and timing while Morrison explained the rules that would govern Tommy's destruction. Morrison positioned Tommy and Marcus in the center of the mat like a director arranging actors for a particularly brutal scene. The contrast between the 8-year-old and the teenager was stark enough to make several parents visibly uncomfortable, but Morrison's reputation kept their objections silent. "Tonight you'll witness real martial arts application," Morrison announced to his audience, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had never been challenged by an equal opponent. "Not the sport fighting you see on television, but the practical techniques that separate dedicated students from casual participants." Marcus stood reluctantly in his brown belt, towering over Tommy like a mountain beside a hill. The 16-year-old's face showed the internal conflict of someone being forced to hurt a child against every decent instinct he possessed. Morrison established rules that heavily favored the larger fighter: full contact sparring, submission, or knockout to finish. No time limits, no protective gear. This demonstrates the reality of conflict outside controlled tournament environments. Several parents exchanged worried glances, recognizing that they were about to witness something closer to child abuse than martial arts instruction. But Bannon's associates moved subtly closer to the crowd, their presence making clear that objections would not be welcomed. Carol started to stand, maternal instincts overriding fear, but one of Bannon's men stepped behind her chair. The threat was implicit but unmistakable. She would watch her son's humiliation or face immediate consequences. "Begin," Morrison commanded with sadistic satisfaction. Marcus approached Tommy slowly, clearly hoping to minimize the damage he was being forced to inflict. He threw gentle punches that barely made contact, earning immediate criticism from Morrison. "Fight like you mean it, Rodriguez." Morrison's voice cut across the silent dojo, or your family's immigration problems become much worse. The threat forced Marcus to increase his aggression. A reluctant front kick connected with Tommy's chest, sending the 8-year-old stumbling backward. Tommy recovered quickly, trying to apply the techniques Tyson had taught him, but the size and skill differences were insurmountable. Marcus's next combination, a palm strike followed by a leg sweep, sent Tommy to the mat hard. The crowd winced at the impact, but Morrison's satisfied smile encouraged Marcus to continue the assault. "Excellent technique," Morrison called out. "Notice how proper training overcomes size disadvantages. Continue the demonstration, Marcus." Tommy struggled to his feet, blood trickling from his nose where he had hit the mat. His white GI was already stained, and his 8-year-old body was clearly outmatched by his teenage opponent. Marcus hesitated, his decent nature rebelling against the systematic brutalization of a child, but Morrison's glare reminded him of the deportation threats hanging over his family. A hard ridge-hand strike to Tommy's ribs dropped the boy to his knees, gasping for air. The sound of the impact echoed through the horrified silence like a gunshot. "Finish it," Morrison commanded, his voice thick with anticipation. The audience watched in uncomfortable silence as the mismatch became obvious. Abuse. Tommy was barely standing, swaying on his feet with tears and blood on his face, while Marcus prepared to deliver the knockout blow that would end his resistance. Carol broke forward instinctively, but Bannon's men immediately blocked her path. "Stay seated, Mrs. Winters," one of them said quietly. "The demonstration isn't finished." Tommy looked across the room at Tyson with the desperate hope of a drowning child reaching for a life preserver. Marcus raised his fist, clearly not wanting to hurt Tommy, but terrified of disappointing Morrison and dooming his family. At the exact moment Marcus's punch began its descent toward Tommy's defenseless head, Mike Tyson exploded into motion. Tyson's movement was instantaneous and devastating, like lightning striking in a clear sky. He crossed the 15-foot distance between his position and the center of the mat in 2 explosive steps, his boxing training allowing him to cover ground with the efficiency of a predator closing on prey. Marcus's fist was halfway to Tommy's head when Tyson's left hand clamped around the teenager's wrist like a steel vise. The boy's punch stopped completely, his 150 pounds of momentum absorbed effortlessly by someone who had spent decades learning to redirect force. "Change of plans," Tyson announced to the shocked room, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had once commanded heavyweight divisions. He pulled Marcus away from Tommy with gentle but irresistible force, then knelt beside the battered 8-year-old to assess his injuries. Tommy's nose was bleeding and his ribs were bruised, but nothing appeared seriously damaged. "The demonstration continues," Tyson said, standing and removing his jacket. He handed it to Carol, who had broken free from Bannon's associates in the confusion, but with different participants. Morrison's face went from confident satisfaction to pale understanding as Tyson's t-shirt revealed arms still thick with muscle despite his age. The casual clothing had hidden the fact that decades of professional training had left permanent marks on his physique. "This is my dojo," Morrison protested, backing away as Tyson began walking toward him with deliberate steps. "You can't just—" "Actually, I can," Tyson interrupted, his famous death stare silencing Morrison's protests. Bannon signaled his 3 associates to intervene, but they hesitated despite their professional obligations. Attacking Mike Tyson, even a 58-year-old version, wasn't a decision anyone made lightly. The audience, realizing they were about to witness something historic, began pulling out phones to record. What had started as Tommy's planned humiliation was transforming into something entirely different. "You want to see real fighting?" Tyson asked conversationally, his hands coming up in the classic boxing stance that had terrorized heavyweight contenders for decades. "Let's educate everyone about the difference between bullying children and facing someone who can fight back." Morrison grabbed a bow staff from the weapons rack, the 6-foot wooden pole spinning expertly in his hands as he assumed a traditional karate stance. His martial arts training was legitimate, his technique polished through years of practice. "I've been waiting for this," Morrison snarled, his humiliation transforming into desperate fury. "Time to show these people what happens when boxers try to fight real martial artists." Tyson circled calmly, his movement patterns displaying the footwork that had made him legendary. "I told you before, nobody hits kids around me." Morrison attacked with a series of complex staff techniques, the wooden weapon whistling through the air with lethal intent. But Tyson's head movement and defensive instincts made him impossible to hit, decades of professional experience allowing him to read Morrison's attacks before they developed. When Morrison overextended on a particularly aggressive thrust, Tyson stepped inside the weapon's range, caught the staff with both hands, and broke it over his knee like kindling. "Your turn to get schooled," Tyson said, throwing the broken pieces aside. The room held its collective breath as two different fighting philosophies prepared to collide with devastating consequences. Morrison was about to learn the difference between martial arts demonstrations and professional violence. Morrison stood weaponless and exposed, his broken bow staff scattered around his feet like the remains of his shattered confidence. But he wasn't alone. Bannon's 3 associates finally overcame their hesitation and moved to surround Tyson, their expensive suits and practiced movements revealing years of professional violence. The first man, Craig, was a former bouncer, whose massive frame had intimidated countless victims in bars and back alleys. He threw a wild haymaker designed to end fights quickly through brute force rather than technique. Tyson slipped the punch with the fluid grace that had made him legendary, his head movement so smooth it seemed effortless. His responding uppercut traveled less than 6 inches, but carried the accumulated power of decades at boxing's highest level. Craig's feet left the ground completely. He hung suspended in the air for a moment that seemed frozen in time before. Gravity reclaimed him, sending his unconscious body crashing into the folding chairs where parents had been sitting moments before. The second attacker, Tony, tried to learn from Craig's mistake by going low, attempting a tackle that would neutralize Tyson's boxing advantages. But Tyson's knee strike met him halfway, connecting with Tony's solar plexus and sending him rolling across the mats, clutching his ribs and gasping for air. Sal, the third associate, pulled a telescoping baton from inside his jacket, the metal weapon extending with a sharp click that echoed through the silent dojo. He swung it at Tyson's head with practiced precision, expecting the older man to back away from the weapon's reach. Instead, Tyson ducked under the swing and stepped inside Sal's guard, delivering a left hook to the liver that dropped the man instantly. Sal's baton clattered across the floor as he curled into a fetal position, his nervous system overwhelmed by the precisely targeted body shot. Total elapsed time, 45 seconds. Morrison stared at the destruction of his backup with the growing understanding that his carefully constructed world was collapsing around him. The men who were supposed to ensure his victory lay scattered across his dojo like broken toys. Bannon, seeing his associates eliminated with surgical precision, began backing toward the rear exit. His expensive suit and corporate demeanor couldn't hide the fact that he was a criminal who had never faced consequences for his actions. "Leaving so soon?" Tyson asked conversationally, his movement blocking Bannon's escape route with the casual efficiency of someone who understood tactical positioning. Bannon's facade of civilized authority cracked completely. "This is just business, Tyson. Nothing personal. We can work something out." Tyson's smile held no warmth. "You threatened a child. You terrorized his mother. You killed a good cop." He stepped closer, his presence filling Bannon's vision like an approaching storm. "That sounds pretty personal to me." Bannon tried to run, but Tyson's hand closed on his shoulder like a steel trap. "You want to fight someone?" Tyson asked, spinning the criminal around to face him. "Fight me." The systematic destruction of Morrison's criminal network had begun, and there would be no mercy for men who built their power on the suffering of children and the intimidation of families. Morrison grabbed a pair of nunchucks from the weapons display, the wooden handles spinning expertly in his hands as he fell back on 20 years of martial arts training. His movements were textbook perfect, displaying the skill that had convinced him he was invincible within his own domain. You think your boxing tricks work against real weapons? Morrison snarled, the nunchucks whistling through complex patterns designed to intimidate and disorient opponents. Tyson circled with the patient confidence of a predator who had faced every type of fighter imaginable. Let's find out. Morrison attacked with a flurry of strikes, the nunchucks moving in figure-8 patterns that created a barrier of wooden violence around his body. His technique was flawless, his timing precise, his confidence growing with each swing that forced Tyson to give ground. But Tyson's defensive movement was pure poetry, his head slipping punches that weren't there while his feet carried him through angles that Morrison's traditional training hadn't prepared him for. Boxing's emphasis on timing and distance translated perfectly to weapons defense. When Morrison overcommit to a particularly aggressive combination, Tyson stepped inside the nunchuck's effective range and delivered a right cross to Morrison's jaw that snapped his head back violently. Morrison staggered but didn't fall, his martial arts conditioning keeping him upright despite the devastating impact. He reset his stance and attacked again, desperation lending speed to his technique. Tyson caught one of the nunchuck handles. In mid-swing, his grip strong enough to stop Morrison's momentum completely. A short left uppercut to the body doubled Morrison over, forcing him to release the weapon. "My turn," Tyson said quietly. What followed was a masterclass in controlled violence. Tyson's combinations were methodical and educational, each punch teaching Morrison a lesson about the difference between martial arts demonstrations and professional fighting. A jab to Morrison's nose broke cartilage with a wet crunch. A hook to the ribs cracked bone and sent Morrison stumbling sideways. An uppercut to the solar plexus lifted him onto his toes before dropping him to his knees. Morrison tried to escape, crawling toward his office, but Tyson followed with the relentless patience of inevitability. There would be no hiding from the consequences of his actions. "Please," Morrison gasped, blood streaming from his broken nose. "I'll stop. I'll leave town. Just don't." Tyson grabbed Morrison's GI and pulled him upright, holding him steady for the final lesson. "You slapped an 8-year-old boy across the face," he said quietly, "in front of his mother. For your amusement." Morrison's eyes showed the desperate understanding of a man finally facing judgment for a lifetime of cruelty. "This is for Tommy," Tyson said, delivering a combination that would end Morrison's reign of terror forever. Left uppercut to the body, right hook to the jaw, left uppercut to the chin. Morrison's lights went out before he hit the floor. Tyson stood over the unconscious bully, not even breathing hard from the exertion. Around the dojo, phones recorded every moment of Morrison's education in real consequences. "Class dismissed," Tyson announced to the stunned audience. The sound of sirens approaching filled the silence that followed Morrison's destruction. Federal agents flooded through the dojo's entrance like a tactical tide, their FBI windbreakers and professional demeanor transforming the martial arts school into an active crime scene. Agent Patricia Hayes led the team, her sharp eyes immediately cataloging the unconscious men scattered across the mats and the broken weapons that told the story of systematic justice. "Mr. Tyson," Agent Hayes said, recognizing him immediately, "we need to sort out exactly what happened here." Tyson gestured calmly toward the destruction around him, his breathing still normal despite having dismantled an entire criminal organization with his bare hands. "Self-defense. 30 witnesses can confirm that." The parents and children who had remained to watch Morrison's downfall nodded eagerly, several already offering to provide detailed statements about what they had witnessed. The legitimate families understood they had been unwitting participants in something far more serious than a martial arts demonstration. Agent Hayes examined the digital evidence that Tyson had uploaded earlier, David Winter's files providing a roadmap to Morrison's entire criminal network. Financial records, surveillance photographs, and recorded conversations painted a comprehensive picture of systematic exploitation spanning 3 counties. "This gives us everything we need," Hayes confirmed, scrolling through bank transfers that connected Morrison's dojo to a web of illegal gambling operations and underground fighting rings. Bannon, revived and handcuffed, tried to negotiate by offering information about bigger players in the criminal hierarchy. "You have no idea how deep this operation goes," he protested as agents read him his rights. Morrison was small time compared to the people above him. But Hayes wasn't interested in deals with men who had built their fortunes on the suffering of children and the intimidation of families. "Save it for your lawyer," she said dismissively. Morrison regained consciousness as paramedics checked. His injuries, his broken nose and cracked ribs, serving as permanent reminders of his encounter with real justice. The charges against him ranged from assault and racketeering to the murder of Detective David Winters, the evidence finally strong enough to ensure he would never terrorize another family. Frank approached Agent Hayes with documentation proving his legal ownership of the dojo, paperwork that Morrison had been using legal manipulation to contest for months. "Can I have my school back?" he asked hopefully. "It's yours," Hayes confirmed. Morrison's legal challenges were part of his criminal enterprise. "You're the rightful owner." Frank made an announcement to the remaining parents and children. "The dojo belongs to the community again. Real martial arts instruction. Proper values. No more fear." Carol knelt beside Tommy, checking his injuries with her medical training while processing the reality that their 2-year nightmare was finally ending. The bruises on her son's face would heal, but more importantly, the psychological wounds of living in constant fear could begin to close. "Is it really over?" Tommy asked, his 8-year-old voice holding hope that had been absent for too long. Carol looked at Morrison being loaded into an ambulance under federal guard, then at Tyson, who was giving his statement to Agent Hayes with calm professionalism. "It's over, baby," she said, meaning it for the first time since David's death. The criminal empire that had fed on fear and exploitation was finally facing justice, and the community could begin healing from years of systematic abuse. 3 weeks later, Tyson pushed through the glass doors of East Side Traditional Karate for the first time since Morrison's arrest. The dojo had been transformed. New mirrors replaced the shattered glass, fresh paint covered walls that had witnessed too much cruelty, and the atmosphere carried the positive energy of a place returned to its proper purpose. Frank's afternoon children's class was in session, 15 kids practicing kata under the patient instruction of their restored sensei. The movements were precise but joyful, displaying the discipline that came from respect rather than fear. Tommy stood in the front row, his white belt tied properly around his small waist as he led younger students through basic techniques. The confidence in his movements showed how much he had grown in 3 weeks of proper instruction, his natural abilities finally free to develop without Morrison's psychological abuse. "Mr. Tyson." The children stopped their practice to greet him respectfully, their faces lighting up with genuine pleasure rather than the fearful attention Morrison had demanded. Tyson had become something of a legend to them, the man who had stood up to the bully when no one else could. But more importantly, he represented the possibility that adults could be trusted to protect children rather than exploit them. Carol sat on the new benches, no longer afraid to watch her son train. The chronic stress lines around her eyes had begun to fade, replaced by the relaxed alertness of a mother who could trust her child's environment. "How's he doing?" Tyson asked, settling beside her to watch Tommy demonstrate proper blocking techniques to a 6-year-old white belt. "Better than fine," Carol replied, her voice carrying peace that had been absent for 2 years. "He's helping other kids now, teaching them that martial arts should make you feel strong, not scared." On the mats, Tommy corrected a younger student's stance with the same patience Frank showed him, the cycle of proper mentorship replacing Morrison's pattern of systematic intimidation. After class, Tyson spoke privately with Tommy, who had gained not just confidence, but genuine respect from his classmates. The other children looked up to him not because he had survived Morrison's abuse, but because he had learned to channel his experience into helping others. "You did good in there," Tyson told him, teaching those younger kids, looking out for them. Tommy beamed with pride that came from accomplishment rather than mere survival. "Frank says a real warrior protects people who can't protect themselves." Frank approached as the dojo emptied, his weathered face showing satisfaction at watching his life's work return to its intended purpose. "Will you be visiting again soon?" he asked hopefully. Tyson paused in the doorway, watching Tommy help a smaller child gather his gear while chatting excitedly about tomorrow's practice. The boy who had once been Morrison's victim was now ensuring other children felt welcome and safe. "Whenever someone needs to learn about respect," Tyson replied. He walked out into the afternoon sun, leaving behind a community that had learned the difference between real strength and bullying, and a little boy who now understood that sometimes heroes show up exactly when you need them most. The cycle of fear had been broken, replaced by the tradition of protection that martial arts was always meant to represent. If you like the story, please watch another story on our channel and subscribe to the channel.